The opening program will be the latest updates on the war situation in Eastern Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, on August 3, Ukraine's military said it has continued to repel Russian data attacks on the city Bakhmut, at the same time, also announced that the situation was very critical, as Russia announced a check on the eastern part of the city, almost half of Bakhmut. And the NATO Secretary General warned that Bakhmut could fail within the next few days. In one of the bloodiest battles of the year-long conflict, Ukrainian forces, which were supposed to be retreating from Bakhmut last week, are now defying everything to entrench themselves in the city. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said, Russia is continuing its intermittent attacks on Bakhmut. Ukrainian defenders repelled attacks in and around the cities. Ukraine's political and military leaders now insist that they will hold on to Bakhmut and inflict more and better Russian casualties to reduce Moscow's combat capabilities. Earlier, Ukrainian President Zelensky said that the battle for Bakhmut and the Donbas region is Ukraine's top priority. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin later said that Wagner fighters had captured the eastern part of Bakhmut. If true, Russian forces already control nearly half of the city in their pursuit of victory this time. Everything east of the Bakhmutka River is completely under Wagner's control, Prigozhin said. The Bakhmutka River is a river that bisects Bakhmut, located on the edge of Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast, most of which is under Russian control. The city center is located on the west side of the river. Ukrainian military analyst Ola Zhdanov said that in addition to the Zabakhmutka district on the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut, Russian forces captured the Ilyanivka district in the north. In the video commentary, he said, the situation is very critical, adding that Russian forces have also achieved many victories near Avdiivka in the south of Bakhmut as well as in the north around the city of Svatovo. At the same time, in the area near Bakhmut, a doctor from the Ukrainian National Guard named Artem said that all roads out of the city were heavily shelled. Ambulances and other vehicles were shelled. Was difficult to evacuate people, he said. Meanwhile, the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence said on March 8 that Russia will become increasingly dependent on its nuclear, cyber and space capabilities as it confronts with great damage from the war in Ukraine. At the recent Senate Intelligence Committee, intelligence officials reported that heavy battlefield losses in Ukraine have reduced Moscow's land and air capabilities and increased its dependence on Russia, country's dependence on nuclear weapons. While the cyber activity surrounding the war has not achieved the speed and impact we had hoped for, Russia will remain the leading cyber threat as it continues to use spyware, increase influence, and conduct offensive campaigns. The report said. U.S. National Intelligence Service Director Avril Haines called Russian President Vladimir Putin's nuclear deterrence to prevent the West from further aid to Ukraine. Speaking to Parliament on March 8, Haines said he may remain confident that Russia can ultimately defeat Ukraine militarily and wants to block Western aid, upsetting the balance and cause conflict with NATO. Ukraine's Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said on March 8 that Ukraine needed 1 million rounds to be able to stop Russian forces and launch a counterattack as soon as possible. Speaking to reporters ahead of a meeting of European Union defense ministers in Stockholm, Reznikov said Ukraine needs 1 million rounds of 155mm and 105mm caliber, worth about €4 billion. Reznikov also said he supported the plan proposed by Estonia for EU countries to jointly donate the ammunition. He said Ukraine needs 90,000 to 100,000 shells per month. The Ukrainian defense minister also said air defense system tanks and ammunition were among the priorities he discussed with EU defense ministers during a meeting on March 8. The number one priority right now is air defense systems, including ammunition, so that Ukraine can be ready to attack, he said. Reznikov said that time is the decisive factor in saving lives, so Ukraine and its allies need to move forward as soon as possible. Recently, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, announced that the bloc would spend €1 billion to jointly participate in the purchase of ammunition sent to Ukraine. At a press conference after a meeting with defense ministers in Sweden, Mr. Borrell said, "I have proposed to raise an additional €1 billion. It is known that Ukraine is in need of ammunition so much that its allies cannot supply it in time. Military officials have agreed to speed up the production of ammunition for Ukraine. A joint effort to buy ammunition would be the next big step in which the European Union joins its member states to supply Kyiv with weapons." Borrell said a joint ammunition purchase agreement was reached at a meeting of defense ministers, but there were still some issues that needed to be discussed further. Referring to the Nord Stream pipeline explosion, the European Union's top diplomat said that no final conclusions should be rushed, after the media published intelligence reports accusing the US of being behind the sabotage. Swedish Defense Minister Pål Jonson said his country was also a party to the investigation, and that he would not comment until the investigation into the Nord Stream pipeline explosion was over. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry on March 8, at a meeting of senior officials at the East Asia Summit in Jakarta, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko warned of threats to political, military of the NATO alliance in the Asia-Pacific region. During the exchange of views on current issues in the Asia-Pacific region, Russia announced its countermeasures to political risks, related to the increased risk of conflict by the alliances, in particular NATO's deployment of resources to East Asia and the establishment of infrastructure in the region. Russia also reaffirmed its unchanged policy of maintaining and strengthening the system of relations among countries in the region, based on the multilateral cooperation platforms established by ASEAN. The Russian Foreign Ministry added, partners in the meeting also paid attention to the importance of strengthening the potential strength of the association and regional foundations. On March 8, the chairman of the Committee on International Affairs of the Russian Lower House, Leonid Slutsky, confirmed that the statement of the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on the reasons for the start of the special military operation in Russia-Ukraine, is a clear and blatant lie, and also insists Mr. Blinken has denied threats to Russia as NATO expands its borders. On Telegram, Slutsky wrote, "Here is new proof of their lies. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has denied that NATO expansion to the east is a threat to Russia. He asserted that NATO expansion, or threat to Russia's security, was never part of NATO's plan. In his words, the reason for the conflict in Ukraine was that the Russian leadership wanted to take Ukraine's freedom and independence." Slutsky stressed, Mr. Blinken's words are a very clear lie. According to the Russian lawmaker, American politicians have not mentioned that Ukraine has been preparing for war with Russia since 2014, nor has Moscow warned the world about NATO's growing approach Russian border. He concluded, ignoring those warnings, NATO eventually announced that the alliance was pursuing an open-door policy, potentially admitting Ukraine. He claims that the West is an empire of lies. At a U.S. Senate hearing on March 8, U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, Director Christopher Wray said that the Chinese government could use TikTok to control the data of millions of people U.S. users, and said the app has raised concerns about U.S. national security. Wray said that the Chinese government could use TikTok to control software on millions of devices and promote a split in relations between Washington and other countries. "This is a tool that is under the control of the Chinese government, and to me it is a concern for national security," Wray said. Earlier on March 7, the White House supported legislation introduced by dozens of senators that would give the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden new powers to ban TikTok and other foreign-origin technologies that threaten national security. Other top U.S. intelligence officials, including Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, CIA Director William Burns, and Director of the National Security Agency Paul Nakasone, agreed at the hearing that TikTok is a threat to U.S. national security. Meanwhile, China has repeatedly called on Western countries to stop repressing TikTok. TikTok itself criticized the measure, asserting that the U.S. ban on TikTok means a ban on communicating America's own culture and values to the more than 1 billion TikTok users around the world. At a regular press conference in Beijing on March 8, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said allegations of Chinese interference in the Canadian election were absurd. Mao continued to re-emphasize China's position: "We do not care and will not interfere in Canada's internal affairs." China has always opposed any country meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. Do not care and will not interfere in the internal affairs of Canada. Some people in Canada are spreading fake news and lies to spread rumors about China, which is absurd. Recently, citing anonymous intelligence sources, Canadian media published reports alleging that China interfered in the Canadian elections in 2021 and 2019. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on March 6 announced it would appoint a special rapporteur to investigate alleged Chinese interference in Canadian elections. Russia's permanent mission to the international organization in Vienna said on March 8 that Moscow believes North Korea will accept participation in negotiations on the nuclear issue on the Korean peninsula, but needs to recommend Pyongyang by tangible measures, namely easing sanctions in UN Security Council resolutions. Speaking after a meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency's board of directors, the Russian delegation said North Korea needs practical incentives to participate in the negotiations. We need to respond to their efforts with a gradual easing of sanctions, which are currently not being implemented by Western nations on the UN Security Council. At the same time, the Russian delegation also pointed out that although the US has affirmed its readiness to negotiate with the DPRK, Washington has not yet taken any practical steps to serve this purpose. Instead of normalizing relations, building trust and discussing security guarantees with the DPRK, the United States is increasing its presence in the region, the delegation said in a statement. According to CCTV, at the annual session of the National People's Congress on March 8, Chinese President Xi Jinping told a representative of the People's Liberation Army that China needs to improve the utilization of resources, defense technology, supply chains, and national reserves to develop the military and increase its ability to win wars. Speaking at the session, Xi said, "Consolidating and improving strategic capabilities is a new requirement that the government has put forward." Dressed in Chinese military blue, he reminded that the military should follow the party's leadership besides. He also asked national laboratories to accelerate research on defense technology, so that China does not have to depend on foreign countries. He also said that supply chains must be more flexible, calling for a boost in infrastructure construction, and the establishment of national reserves for defense purposes. On March 8, the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria called on all parties involved in the conflict in Syria and the international community to work together to find a political solution to end the unrest, which has lasted for more than a decade in this Middle Eastern country. Rounds of UN-backed discussions years ago failed to find a solution to the 12-year conflict in Syria. Speaking to the media in Geneva, Special Envoy Geir Peterson called for a step-by-step approach to prepare the parties involved to move towards a treaty. There needs to be a real political solution led by Syria and supported by the United Nations, Peterson said. The current state of conflict is unacceptable. The conflict in Syria has killed hundreds of thousands of people, affected millions, and made it worse after the earthquake on February 6. Peterson stressed that the parties to the conflict and the international community must strive to find a peaceful solution in the same way that they made concessions to each other to deal with the earthquake disaster. Recently, U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price voiced concern about aid shipments entering Syria's Aleppo International Airport, after it was attacked on March 7. The incident prompted Syrian authorities to reroute flights to deliver humanitarian aid to victims affected by the recent earthquake. The Syrian authorities blamed Israel for the attack. However, Prime Minister Netanyahu's government has denied this allegation. Over the years, Israel has launched attacks against Iran-backed rebels in Syria. Tehran's government has grown increasingly influential since it supported Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the 2011 civil war. According to the Syrian news agency Sana, this is the second time Aleppo airport has been attacked in just 6 months. The Syrian air defense intercepted the missiles fired from the Mediterranean Sea west of the city of Latakia at 2 a.m. The attack damaged airport facilities, but there were no casualties. "We have received a report of the incident. We are unable to comment further at this time, but the incident is very disturbing when it comes to Aleppo airport. This is the main line of support for earthquake victims," the Syrian Transport Ministry said. The aid flights were diverted towards the cities of Damascus and Latakia. Foreign donors including the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Algeria have been sending aid to Aleppo airport since the devastating earthquake in early February. The Syrian Foreign Ministry declared the attack a crime to target humanitarian aid shipments to victims affected by the earthquake. Regarding recent refugee policies, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has defended the government's proposal to stem the flow of illegal migrants, while also supporting them. During a recent session, Sunak said stopping boats from crossing the English Channel is not his only priority, but people are still the most important. The recently enacted bill sets out a range of measures to stem the flow of illegal migrants to the UK. Last year, the British government announced it would send refugees back to their home country of Rwanda. Under the new UK rules, people who have crossed the border who have reached the UK will still be held in one place and not be released on bail to find a new place in the country. The refugees will have to wait until they are sent back to their home countries. Last year, 45,000 people crossed the border to Britain in small boats across the English Channel. Prime Minister Sunak said he was working on a solution so that the government could spend £2 billion a year in support of refugees. Joining the wave of protests on March 8, many French women took to the streets to march in Paris to protest against the government's pension reform plan, which is considered disproportionate for women. Previously, the French government wanted to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Critics say the policy is unfair to women, because their careers are often subject to change, due to issues related to childbirth. We women often have more precarious contracts, so the pension is also less. It was not our fault or our choice. The march against the French government's reforms focused on women's rights to pensions. According to French data, French women earn on average 40% less than men and their pensions are 40% less than men's. French Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne said the disagreement had reached the point of no longer being negotiable, but the Macron administration continued to implement a plan that greatly affects women's rights. To mark International Women's Day on March 8, thousands of women in Israel gathered in a human chain to protest against the right-wing coalition government's plan to reform the justice system to reduce their rights court term. Many women from all walks of life in Israel have joined protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's policies. Protest groups, wearing red shirts, lined up along a road next to Tel Aviv's seafront. They chanted "democracy" throughout the march. We see that every step of judicial reform will be something that hurts women and our rights. We were about to be deprived of all our rights and achievements, which had to be very difficult to obtain. That is very dangerous and we will not accept it. 2 days earlier, Israeli President Isaac Herzog had promised to prepare a compromise with the people. However, opposition group leader Benny Gantz told Reuters that the women's protests would not be negotiable unless judicial reform stopped. Agreements can be reached, but promises of democracy are not, he added. March 8 should have been a day for us to celebrate and be happy. But we need to protest against the government again. We must draw red lines and will not allow the government to compromise our interests. The wave of protests in Israeli cities has increased, with protesters holding up slogans such as "hurting women's rights, not innovation" or "women's struggle." Ladies and gentlemen, in the joyful atmosphere of the world celebrating International Women's Day, March 8, in Rio de Janeiro, the iconic statue of Jesus the Redeemer of the coastal city and Brazil was unveiled last night, covered with a bright pink glow. Also on this special occasion, women of all ages poured into the streets of Rio, participating in a musical party with many fun activities and carrying banners promoting equality and the spirit of International Women's Day. In it, many people have sent messages asking the Brazilian government to legalize abortion and end gender-based violence. Last March 8, U.S. First Lady Jill Biden together with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hosted the 17th International Women of Courage (IWOC) award ceremony. This is the first year this award is held at the White House. This year's event has 11 recipients. Among them are the following prominent figures. The first is Yulia Terapievska, the head of a volunteer medical organization in Ukraine, and at the same time she was awarded the award. Known for filming documentaries of what Russian soldiers did in Mariupol, followed by Ethiopian veteran and journalist Miaza Mohammed, who has always fought against gender-based violence in African countries. The third is Zakira Hekmat, a doctor in Afghanistan who specializes in helping immigrants and refugees from Afghanistan during the early stages of the Taliban's rise to power. The IWOC is an annual award from the United States Department of State that honors women around the world with leadership, courage, and willingness to sacrifice for others, especially to promote growth women's rights. In addition, on International Women's Day August 3, many rallies took place around the world to call for women's rights after 2022 witnessed many unfair problems with women. Typically, examples include the Taliban government banning girls from school, the wave of protests in Iran over the death of Mahsa Amini, and the U.S. overturning a ruling on abortion rights. Protests took place in France, Germany, Lebanon, Indonesia, Singapore, and many other places. During his 3-day visit to India, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese attended ceremonies during the colourful traditional Hindu festival of Holi. In Gandhinagar city, Gujarat province, Australian Prime Minister Albanese was warmly welcomed with tilak signs when people used red ink to dot 3 points on their faces. After that, he participated in the traditional Holi rituals, especially the colourful flower tossing display at the governor's house located in the west of Gandhinagar city. Holi is an opportunity for us to reinvent ourselves and connect with people. With that in mind, It is not surprising that this festival is warmly received not only by Australic Indians but also by Indigenous Australians. The Albanese Modi talks in New Delhi this Friday will be the first meeting of the annual summit announced by the two countries last year. No matter what the future holds, I know that the Australian Indian and Australic communities living and working here will still be an important part of the path of development cooperation between the two countries, building together closer economic and cultural ties, while maintaining security in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, March 9, Prime Minister of Australia, Albanese and Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi will attend the Test cricket final match between India and Australia at Modi Stadium. Catherine, Princess of Wales, visited members of the Irish Guards at the Salisbury Plain Training Ground. This is also the first visit of Catherine, since the wife of Crown Prince William was promoted to the rank of Colonel. In January, the British royal family announced Catherine's title as Colonel of the Irish Guards. This position previously belonged to her fiancé, Prince William. The Princess of Wales' visit to Salisbury Plain is also part of the royal family's International Women's Day celebrations. The area was still affected by the winter weather with ice and strong winds, but the soldiers were excited by the appearance of the princess in military uniform. Sergeant Jack Griffiths, good to see her. Usually the times we pick up Catherine when the Duchess is with her husband William. He was our former colonel. But obviously it was great to see the Duchess on her first visit as our new colonel. At the visit, Catherine met, talked and understood more about the work of the Irish Guardsmen and sent words of encouragement to the members on duty. At the end of the program, inviting you to an exhibition of paintings at the Picasso Museum in Paris. British designer Paul Smith has brought new life to the works of the artist Pablo Picasso. The 76-year-old fashion designer has collaborated with the museum to create an exhibition to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Picasso's death. Famous for his plaid and monkey fashions, Smith has repainted the background with patterns and textures that remind viewers of Picasso's works. All have been modified by Smith with more vibrant and modern colors. Smith's brilliant ceramic plates are set on white industrial plates. Besides, famous works by Picasso such as Portrait of Dora Maar or Bust of a Woman in a Striped Hat are hung on the vertical striped walls in blue and yellow tones. My idea was to show Picasso's work anywhere. The once famous Cubist motifs will be reimagined with new vigor. The exhibition was conceived 4 years ago when Smith was inspired by the collection of nearly 200,000 works at the Picasso Museum. The museum side said they hope the exhibition will attract many people to admire.